Hi everybody, and welcome to the Postman video. Postman is an HTTP client that tests web services. It's an easy way of testing and documenting the API of our code. On its site, the Postman team says Postman is the only complete API development environment. It's not maybe the only one, or we can argue about the completeness, but it is a very popular one, and it's pretty powerful, as we'll see shortly. So it was developed by these people. These are the founders. The guy in the middle is Abhinav Asthana, and he was the original founder or original developer. So he was working a day job, and at night at home, he was working on this Postman as a side project, and eventually it grew, and he quit his day job. He brought in these other two founders and formed this company, Postman. So it's kind of it's a cool story because it's kind of this typical, nice startup story. So that's the scoop with Postman. So I'm going to give a fairly short introduction. Postman itself is fairly complex. I think there's lots of stuff I'll just be not covering, but I'll give you enough so you can get started with Postman. So that's kind of the goal of this video. So you can download Postman here, and let me just go to that site. So it auto-detected that I'm on a Mac, but you can see there's a Windows version and a Linux version. This is a free software for individuals. We can see the plan and pricing here. So for small teams and individuals, it doesn't cost anything. That's fantastic. And even if you're a small startup, the cost isn't that great. So I'll let people go ahead and download it. And once you download it and install it, come back to this video. The core idea of Postman is something called a collection. A collection is an executable API description. So we've seen API descriptions before that we showed them in the last video where we were doing a simple campground thing. It was pretty trivial really, but at least I showed you what the API looked like, how we can describe an API. And this just enables us, this collection is an executable API description, and it also enables us to test our API. So some really crucial things, but the idea is that it's a collection. So as an example, we'll go back to campgrounds. It's a slightly different version of it, but it's the same idea. You know, people want to take their camper van somewhere and camp out and want some information about campgrounds. And here's the API. So we're going to have this get request that's info. It'll take one argument Q, and that's the campground to search for. And if it finds a campground with that name, it'll return some information in this JSON object, like as an example, like I showed here. Else, it'll return, else meaning it didn't find a campground, and it'll return HTTP code 404. Now you may think, well, what is this HTTP code 404, or even what is an HTTP code? And for that, let me go to my browser. And I'll just type in search HTTP status codes. And I'll go to this one here. So you've probably seen some of these. The most typical one is way down here. 404 not found. So if you type in a web address and it's not there, it'll probably give you this 404 error that it couldn't find what you wanted, or you typed in a page wrong. So there are status messages when things go right, like a 200 means everything went fine. Or there are these status messages that are more error-oriented. So you can see it's unauthorized, bad request, not found, and so on. So that's what I mean by a status message or return a 404 error. So it's a 404 means not found. So in our case, it's searched for a campground and couldn't find it. So it's going to return this 404 error. Another part of our API will be another GET request, and this time it's near, and that takes an argument called the key is city, and that's the city to search for. And the idea in English is tell me what campgrounds are near this city. So for example, if I type in my search Ruidoso, New Mexico, I want to return all those campgrounds, Three Rivers, South Fork, Oak Grove, that are near Ruidoso. And else, if it doesn't find that city in the database, it'll return with that 404 error, not found. And finally, in our API, we'll have a post request for add, so we can add another campground to our database. And that'll take all the fields we want, like the name of the campground, the city it's near, the description of the campground, and what's the toilet description. And it'll return a JSON just containing the city and the campground is shown here. And that just returns saying, hey, I did insert it into the database. If you're trying to insert something that's already in the database, it'll send that code 409 with text duplicate entry. Else it'll send that code 400. So let's take a look what 409 is. So 409 is some conflict, so that's the code we're using. And the typical way we use Postman is this, or let's say the ideal way we would use Postman is this. We would write the Postman collection before we write any code. So the order sort of is everyone gets together on the team, agrees on some API, hammers out the details of that API, and then we write our Postman collection, which includes all our tests. Why would we use that order rather than, hey, let's write the code and then write the test stuff, is because we might have some latent biases. Once we write the code, we know how that code works, so we could be writing the tests to perfectly match our code rather than writing tests that perfectly match the API. It could be a subtle difference. So for example, you might assume, well, cities can only be 20 characters long. That's kind of a weird assumption, but let's go with it, or 80 characters long or whatever. And, the tests, we can evaluate whether, all those things work, or, someone doesn't put in some entry or leave something blank. So we can write these tests and hopefully we'll avoid those latent biases that you might have as the writer of the code. Things are a bit more fluid than that. Writing code, when you're writing the code, you may think of things we missed in the API. So you'd get back together in your team and said, we missed handling this particular situation. And then you'd revise the API or add to the API. And as a result, you'd modify the Postman collection. But for the most part, we want to do it, write the collection, then write the code. Now, even though I said this a bunch of times, in this video, I'm going to deviate from that slightly just because I think it helps you understand Postman a bit more if I have some pre-existing code that I'm demoing against. So don't do what I'm doing in this video. Do what I'm showing in this slide, which is once you figure out what the API is, write your test suite, and you'll be fine. All right, so here's the steps we're going to follow. We're going to create an environment. I'm not thinking you know what an environment is yet, but we'll learn that shortly. We'll create a collection, which is an executable API. We're going to create requests within that collection. That means, we had a GET request for info about a particular campground. So we'd create a request within that collection in Postman, and we'll create some tests to make sure everything works. So that's sort of what we'll be looking at in this video. All right. So let's look at this first step, creating an environment. Now, here's why we'd want an environment. So I'm sitting on my development laptop, writing my backend server code, and I want to test it. So I will be testing on my laptop, and my laptop's address is http://localhost and port 8080. So I run through all my tests, I write the tests, and test it there. Now, I may put it somewhere else. I may combine my code with other people in my development group, and we put it on a server somewhere in the cloud, and we want to test it against those addresses. So we want to run the tests on 185.199.109.153. So we might want to run it on these addresses. So we don't want to rewrite or revise our test suite. We want to just be able to switch between one environment, my development laptop, to another environment, our test server that runs on the cloud somewhere, without altering too much of our test suite. So that's the idea of an environment. We're going to specify this is the laptop environment. This is our test environment in the cloud. So we'll be able to switch. It'll become clear in 1 second. All right, let's go to Postman. All right, so here is the main panel of Postman. And the environment I mentioned is here on the upper right. Right now, the environment I have running is local. So it's the name I've given my desktop environment, that localhost one. And I can see what the values are of things by clicking this eye here. That's the environment quick look panel. And I'm just going to do that And you can see I have this URL with my value for HTTP localhost 8080. So that'll enable me to run my collection, to run my tests on my desktop, because I have it set to local. I could change my environment to my production machine. And now when I look up this URL that I set, I gave it this name URL. It's nothing special. It's a good name. And you can see the initial value is different. Let me just show you how to create an environment. We click this little gear. And let's say I want to create an environment called my MacBook. And I want to add a variable. I'll just name it URL because that's what I've been using. And let's say everything. And that runs on 3000, let's say. I don't know. And that's it. I'll just add that. So now I have this environment MacBook. And I'm in production. I can switch to MacBook. I can look what my URL is, and it's the one I just put in here. I can switch to local, and that value changes. So that is environments. It may seem like, why are we doing this? That explanation, you'll see it very shortly. All right, the next step is we want to make a collection for our project. So we have this campground project, and we want to make a collection for it. So let's go ahead and do that. So here under New, I'll select Collection, and I just give it a name. So let's say I want to call it National Parks. This is going to house all the executable code or executable API tests that I'm constructing. I'll just close this panel for now. And you can see we now have this National Parks collection. There's nothing in it, 0 requests, but I have that collection. All right, now we're going to look at entering in those requests. So let's look at this one first. It's a GET request called info. It takes this argument Q, which is a campground, and it's going to return this JSON object. So let's give that a try. So to create a new request, I go here to New and say Request. And I give it a name. So let's say I want to get the info for the campground saddle. Here it says select a collection or folder to save to. I want to save it to the National Parks one. I'll select that down here. And it says save to National Parks. All right, so I've created a request. I've given it a name, but I really haven't entered any details about how to do the request. So we know it's a GET request. Here's where that URL comes in handy. So I'm running it on my local machine, so it wants to be localhost, but instead I'm just going to use that variable name. So it's URL in these two braces means, hey, it's a variable. Go look up my environment and find out what the value is. Right now, when I'm running that environment, that URL is this localhost 8080. If I change it to MacBook, it was localhost port 3000. If I change it to my development or production environment, it's HTTP 104.196.253.152. So when I'm executing this GET command here, this URL variable will be replaced by this value. So it enables us to have write one request and have it used in multiple environments. So that's pretty cool. And the request was called info. And here's where I put in the key value pairs. So the key was Q. The campground I want to search for is saddle. So I have a GET request. It's that info. You see that when I typed in these parameters here, since it's a GET request, it's showing those parameters in the URL. So let's save this request. And now I'll send this request. Sweet. So I have here the returned result, ID, name, saddle, closest town, Cloudcroft, the description of the campground, and so on. What the restrooms are like, things like that. So that's creating this GET request for info. Let's go on. Well, before we move on, let's test if it returns this code 404 if we have some campground that's not in our database. Since we're writing the code, here's our database and all the names. It's not a very large collection of campgrounds, but enough to do a simple little application like this. And let's just invent a campground to search for. So instead of saddle, let's search for Smoky. It's not in there. And I get a not found here. The status code is here. So you see that it's showing the status code 404 not found. Let me go back to saddle and do that send. You can see that the status code is 200, which means OK. So that's where the status will appear in this interface. Let me go ahead and save that. Let's implement this near one, this near part of the API. It's going to take this argument with key city and the name of the city to search for, and it'll return this JSON object that'll look like this. So if I search for Ruidoso, New Mexico, I should get this result. So let's try this one. So I'm going to create a new request. That's new request. I'll say near, oops, sorry. And it'll be in the National Parks folder or collection. And it's a GET request. Here I'm using my URL variable. And the key was city. And let's go with that example that was in our API description, just Ruidoso, New Mexico. So that looks all fine. Let me save it and send it. And I get the results. City, Ruidoso, New Mexico, and those campgrounds. So that's cool. Let's search for a city that doesn't exist in our database, like Silver City. I know it's not there. And I get that 404 not found error. Cool. Let me bring it back to Ruidoso. Okay. All right. Let's do the last API request. So it's this post request called add. It takes name, city, description, and toilets as arguments or keys, and it'll insert something into the database. That's kind of what we're hoping with this, but it'll also return just a JSON verifying it does. If it's a duplicate entry, meaning that we've already added this campground, it'll return that 409. Also, it'll return 400. So let's give this a shot. So we want a new request. This one's called add, let's say Scorpion Ridge. It's in the National Park collection. Okay, this time it's a post request. The URL is URL add. Okay, and this time it's not query parameters, but remember in a post request we put those key argument values in the body of that post request. So I click here for body, and they are URL encoded. So I'm going to select URL encoded, and then I'm going to add those arguments. So one key was, I think, the name of the campground, and I'll call it Scorpion Ridge. And the other key was city. Let's go with Ruidoso, New Mexico. Another key was description. A remote campground with 12 sites. Keep it short. And toilets. Vault. Toilets 2. All right, so that looks good. So we created a post request named add or /add. We put all the arguments in the body of the text. They're URL encoded, and the arguments are here. Let me just save that, and let's hope for the best. So hopefully it added it. Ruidoso, New Mexico, Scorpion Ridge, so it returned. Let's just try to add it again. So we're going to get that duplicate error, hopefully. This time we got status 200. We got duplicate entry, status 409, conflict. So that's pretty cool. So now it's time to add some tests. I mean, we're able to use this and visually inspect the requests and see if they match the API, but we can automatically test that. And that's what we're going to be doing in this next phase, adding tests. And for this, we need to think like a tester. And what I mean is we don't want to think like the following, like where we test it once, like we just ran through the 3 things and they look good, right? We went here and we ran this and we looked here and that looked good. And we ran it with the other test and it looked good. And we tried this near Ruidoso and that looked good. And we tried Saddle and that looked good. So heck, we looked at everything and it looks good. So now we're absolutely 100% sure our code works. And that's sort of the wrong way to look at it, right? We want to think of, well, how can we really test it? What could possibly go wrong? So that's all about writing some valid tests, thinking like a tester. What could go wrong? How can we prove that this works? What happens if I add an apostrophe? Will that work? What happens if it's, a long thing? What happens if we're missing an argument? So all those things would be good reasons to do tests. We want our code to fail kind of gracefully and not catastrophically. All right, so let's do a test. Let's start with this info saddle and see if we get good results. So in order to add a test, let me just lower this a bit. There's this entry called tests. I'll click on it. And here we can try different things. There's the snippet list on the right that we can use. And I'm just going to scroll a bit. And I'm going to use this one, response body JSON value check. And we can name it, and this can be our basics. Okay, and here is the thing we're changing here. So this JSON data is the JSON object we get back, and this is the key. This value would be the name of the key. We don't have value, but we do have name. Let's check if the JSON object has a key called name with the value saddle. So we can do that. That would be here, JSON data dot name to equal okay, and let's add another entry here. So let's say we'll test for that closest town thing. Okay, and let's give this a shot. So let's send this information again. And here now we see we get test results 1 of 1. We can click there and see that that passed the basic saddle test. One other option I could have done is, let me just copy this. And just do each test separately. So I want to check to see if saddle is there and if the town's there. So let me just delete this one. And I can get it past 2 tests. So it's a bit up to you how to organize it, but that shows you the basic idea of how to test things. So again, we're trying to think like a tester. So we might think, well, we tried it with a 1-word campground name. Let's just double check and make sure things work fine with the 2 word campground name. So let's try that. The request name is, I'm going to try info on 2-word campground. Apache. I think I have one Apache Creek. I'll look in a second. I think there was something hollow. Let's check. So here's the database. We have a campground called Apache Creek. Let's see if we get that back. So that's Reserve, New Mexico, and it's a nice quiet. So let's check if we have that one. Apache Creek, Reserve, New Mexico. So I'll stick with this one. It's in national parks. So we know how to do this. It is a GET request. Q Apache Creek. And we want to do a test. So we're going to use that JSON value check. So that all looks the same, and we're going to check. This is Apache Creek test 1. Name. So that should equal Apache Creek. And let's just do another separate test for the town. Town. Okay, so we're going to test the name and the town. So let's review what we have here. So we're doing a GET request with the info, and our parameters are Apache Creek, and the test is we're testing to see if we get that name back, Apache Creek, and the closest town will be Reserve, New Mexico. So let's give this a shot. And we see we failed on 2 tests. We wanted Apache Creek, and we got apparently back Apache, and we wanted Reserve, New Mexico, and we got Cloudcroft, New Mexico. So we have some problem in our code, and we'd have to go back and check what the problem is. So what's happening is it's returning this one, this Apache, Cloudcroft, New Mexico, instead of Apache Creek. So it looks like it's only returning, the first, it's only searching on that first word. And so we'd go ahead and fix that. So here's an example of writing a test without looking at our source code and seeing if we run into problems. Well, let's go ahead and fix that source code. All right, that source code is fixed. So now we can check whether that code works, and we see that it passed both tests. Okay, and let's take a look at our API to make sure if we're missing anything. So here's that info argument. So it's going to return that campground, and that's indeed what we're testing. But if it doesn't find the campground name, it should return 404. So let's write that test. Let me just save this. So for this, we need a new request. So I'll go new request info for Smoky. Let's just call it the Smoky Campground. So it's going to be called info for Smoky. We're testing the Smoky Campground. And it's a GET request. And this is URL again. And we want info. Key is Q. And the value is Smoky. So let's just call it the Smoky Bear Campground. And now we want to write a test. We should get a 404 error. So let's write a test. And now we want to check a status code. And we look through our snippets and get status code should be 200. We'll click there. And we don't want 200. We want 404. So let's check that one. I'm going to save it and send it. Oh, that's my error. That was just the name I changed and not the actual test. So we're actually looking for the status code 404. Let me just save it and run it again. There, and so that worked. So our source code so far is good. So let's go on and do the next one, which is near. So near looks like this, that we should get the city returned and the campgrounds, a list of campgrounds. So it's just campgrounds, and then a list that contains the strings of the campgrounds. Else we'll return that 404. So I'll just click on that one we already had, near Ruidoso, and let's add a test. All right, now this one here, you see we have a bit of a issue, or not an issue. We need to kind of go within a list to see if things are there, right? It's not going to be as simple as the other example we gave. So let's go ahead and do that. So this we have to write ourselves. So I'm just going to get that JSON object. So that's this whole JSON object that we kind of see down here. And now I want to check whether the campground data, that list, has these entries. Let's just check Three Rivers and South Fork. So to do this, I need to create a test. And this is where I give the test a name. And let's give it call it the Three Rivers test. And what I want to do is see if results, which is this whole JSON object down here, dot campgrounds, which is that list, includes, and here's where I'm searching for a string, Three Rivers. Right, so I'm going to see if that includes Three Rivers. And let's just do another one. All right, so let's write that South Fork one. Perhaps I should have just copied the above one, but we'll go with this. All right, so this is a little bit new to you, perhaps, but I'm hoping you can see some sense to it. So what I've done in the first line is I get that JSON object, what we're seeing down there in the body that's returned, and I'm calling it results. And here I'm naming a test. So what's to the right of this equals has to be a binary, true, false result. So this just asks, is it included here? So if the test will pass if Three Rivers is included in the campground list, else it'll return false. So let's give this a shot. Let me save this. And let's send this off. Okay, and it passed my test. Let's say I have a different server running, a different implementation of it. So I'm going to send it. You can see it failed. So I got some failures there. If I look at what I received, you can see that it's a little bit wonky. I'm not getting, I was to get just a list of strings, and now I'm getting a list of these JSON objects with name and the name of the campground. So let me go back to the correct server. So in a similar way, we'd be adding tests for that add post request. One thing we might think of is, hey, if that add post request were successful, let me just go to that Scorpion Ridge one. So if I put it in twice, that's why I'm getting a duplicate entry. But if it actually added this information, if I do a get, I would expect that get to include this stuff. So part of my test would be to add another request. So let me try that one. So testing add by using get, by using info. So here it's a get request with that URL. The key is Q, and the value was Scorpion Ridge. So we'd expect the name to be Scorpion Ridge. And we'd expect the town. Let's do that town test too. And let me go to that post request. The town was Ruidoso, so we would expect the closest So here we're doing a GET request with this info, not to test how our info code works, but just to test to make sure we're putting stuff in the database. So it's really testing add. And let's go ahead and save this and let's send it. And here you see our test does return correctly. And if we look at the body, it does look good. So this is kind of scratching the surface. So even with just 3 things in our API, we want to add a lot more tests, right? We want to make sure when we say we should return 404 or 409 that we're getting those and they're good. We were testing whether, what happens when we return something with 2-word campground and we saw that, the source code could have some problems. What happens if there's an apostrophe? Just kind of our thinking, what are all the possible tests? And, having a pretty good complete test suite. So that, I'm hoping, explains how Postman works. And now let's look at how to run all the tests in a collection. And to do that, we go to the collection, and that's here on the left panel. And we click that arrow. And here we have this option Run, which will open up a new window. So here on the right, we can say, how do we want to run them? We can change the order. We can select some and deselect some. For now, let me just run all the collection. And you see everything passed fine. So that's a way of running. Let me do a new run here. So if I just want to run a few, I can just deselect them and run that national park. So if you deliver your code, you're done with testing on your laptop, you deliver the code to your test server, and you just want to run through the test once more to verify everything works, this would be the way to do it. You can run through all your tests. So you can hit Run Summary here and get just the summary of what it is, and it looks good. Everything passed. So 4 passed, 0 failed. Cool. And let me just show you an error you might get. So here I created a new request. This just a basic info one with the term Wolf Hollow, and I want to add a test to this. Let me just change this quickly. I'm trying to generate one that has an error. Wolf. Okay, I'm going to save it. And now I see that I made this mistake. It's not value here. It should be name. So I'm going to change that. And I'm just going to send it to see if I get good results. And this test works fine. So now I go to my national parks. I think this is already open, but let me just open it again. And I'll want to run through all those again. Here you see there's a fail here, assertion error expected undefined to deeply equal Wolf Hollow. And the reason is that I forgot to save that request after I fixed that error. So it's a simple matter of just saving that. So if you're getting confused about why everything looked good when you were running the tests individually, but when you went to run them all, it's probably because you forgot to save one of them. So just remember to save everything. All right, sweet. Next, I'd like to quickly talk about how to share collections. So you're working with the team and you just want to share your test suite with others, or they want to share things with you. How can you go and do that? There's several ways to do this. One is just to share a link with your request. Every time when you initially created your Postman application, when you downloaded it and installed it, it probably asked you for a login. And the benefit of that is, regardless of where you are developing your stuff on your laptop or on your desktop, it's saving a copy of all of what you do to the cloud. So when you get on if you're working on your desktop and switch to your laptop, all your stuff, all your tests collection will be there. So if I want to share that with others, I can go again to the National Park Collection here, click on that arrow, and this time I'll select Share. And I can just get a link, and there's my link. So I can just copy that link and send it off as an email to people, give it to people, and they can just use that to access my collection. So that's real cool. And in turn, people can send you a link to access their collection. So when you're working on stuff together, you can share one Postman collection, and your part of the code can be tested on that shared collection. Sweet. The other option is to export a collection and just send that whole collection as a text file, as a JSON file, to other people. So instead of sharing a link, you're actually sharing the file that represents your collection. And to do that, you click on these 3 dots here of the collection, and you say Export. And you get some options here. The recommended one is this version 2.1, so that's the one to use. And you just can export it. It saves it as a JSON file to wherever you want on your machine, and then you can just email that off to your friends, to your development team. Once you get one of these, if someone sends you a file like that, up here you can select Import, choose the file. Let me choose this one here. I have several on my machine. I already did this once, so I'll just import as a copy. And there it is down here. So it's a collection that has 25 different requests. So that's several ways of sharing information. So I hope this video was helpful. So I showed you kind of the basics of Postman, what kind of thinking you need in order to get a good API and test collection in Postman, and how to actually use it. I didn't cover all the details. There's many more features of Postman that I'm not showing here, but I believe it's enough to get you started. So I'm hoping this was helpful, and I'll see you in the next video where we're going to create a node server that actually accesses a database. So that's cool. See you next time. Bye.